All right, hey, welcome back. We're going to hit the tail end of this absolutism look. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at a kingdom in England that was not part of absolutism, or at least it tried not to be. And so let's do that. So we've already talked about Henry VIII. And Henry VIII, of course, all he wants was a son. And he ends up extending his power, but he doesn't necessarily, it'd be a stretch to call Henry VIII an absolute monarch, right? And so the Tudor dynasty lasts from 485 to 1603. And 1603 is when Elizabeth finally dies. And of course, Elizabeth never marries. So therefore, Elizabeth never has any children or a legitimate, she doesn't have any children. She doesn't marry, she doesn't have any kids. All right. So England has a history of having laws that limit the power of the king. And that's going to be important because all the way back in 1512, you have King John, who basically goes out with hunting with a bunch of nobles, and they get him off of his horse, and they're like, here, either you sign this paper or you're not going to go back and be king anymore. And of course he does. And so it starts to limit some of the powers of the king. Like it lets nobles be tried by in courts of law instead of by the king, right? And it also establishes a parliament, which limits the king. And so it's a lawmaking body. It has a House of Lords, House of Commons, and the king has to work with them. And so you can kind of see this checks of balance of powers between I don't know, between absolute monarchs and between monarchs and lawmaking bodies like parliament or somebody that's going to limit their power. And you can kind of see the legacy of the Magna Carta. I know we're just like skipping right through this, but it's really not all that necessarily important to our understanding. But the Magna Carta is important in the fact that it lays the foundation for things like the Petition of Rights and the English Bill of Rights, and then eventually the American Constitution, all the way up to the Declaration of Human Rights by the UN, and our ideas of modern limited government really kind of come from this idea of the Magna Carta, and it creates some kind of a lawmaking body that's controlled outside of the king's power. And so England is going to have this while other European nations don't. Spain doesn't have any limits on the king's power, or neither does France. Okay, so during the rule of Henry VIII and Elizabeth, Parliament's going to play a relatively large role in the lives of your common everyday European people. It's going to raise taxes. It's going to lower taxes. It's going to fund wars. It's going to control public opinions about Elizabeth, about the ideas of the government, those types of things. And so it has its purpose, right? After Elizabeth dies, her cousin James I takes over. And James I believes in this idea of divine right. He looks around, he sees what's going on in Spain, he looks around, sees what's going on in France and other places, and he's like, why can't I have that type of power? And so he resents Parliament's power to limit what he can do. And so he gets rid of Parliament for a long period of time. Well, he rules, and as long as everything's going well, it's no big deal. But then all of a sudden, he dies, and Charles I takes over. I believe Charles I is James I's brother. It doesn't really matter. And he becomes king. And he needs money. And so he recalls Parliament because he needs to raise taxes. And Parliament agrees that they will raise taxes, but only if Charles will sign something known as the Petition of Rights. And so this Petition of Rights basically guarantees things like Parliament must approve all tax increases. They need to outlaw unjust imprisonments, just silly laws or whatever. Excuse me. Outlaw the forced housing of military by civilians, right? Outlaws this idea of martial law where you can just suspend rules of the rule of law that's written down, so the military can't take over everything. And so Charles I does this, but then he dissolves Parliament for 11 years, a little bit over a decade. And the nobles of England start to resent this. And so then in 1637, Charles tries to impose the Anglican religion on the people of Scotland. He's trying to force religion on people like an absolute monarch does. He's going to try to control all of their lives. And the Scots revolt because the Scottish people are just like crazy, and you can't get them to agree on anything. For goodness sakes, they invented golf, which is the most frustrating thing in the world, let alone try to get them to like do normal things, right? And so Charles needs money to put down this rebellion, so he calls up Parliament for a new tax. And so Parliament goes in and he tries to get rid of them again, but they won't dissolve. And so they struggle for power in England, and Parliament tries to basically accuses some of Charles's advisors of committing crimes against England, and they execute some of them, right? And then Charles tries to arrest everybody in Parliament, rolls over there with his like security forces and tries to surround Parliament, and Parliament escapes out of like this back tunnel, and Parliament goes and they form their own little army, right? Because again, well, they form their own little army. And so like this idea of a large standing army as a tool of the tool of an absolute monarch doesn't necessarily exist in England, because England has this history of not having large standing armies on the nation, and this or on the island of England, Great Britain. And this is going to be one of the things that's going to cause problems when we get to the American Revolution. Okay, so Parliament forms its own army, and they fight. The supporters of Charles are called the Cavaliers, and the supporters of Parliament are called the Roundheads. And if we've ever missed a mascot opportunity, it is the fact that we don't know, there's no high school anywhere that I know of, that I'm aware of, that's called the Roundheads. But they are that's a pretty fantastic name, right? And Oliver Cromwell is going to lead the Roundheads, and he's going to win. And it doesn't really, if this was European history or English history, we'd spend a lot more time on it, like the battles, I guess. But like the fact is that the Roundheads are victorious, and they capture the king, and they capture the king's forces. And so they capture Charles I, and they put him on trial, and they charge him with being a tyrant and a traitor and a murderer and a public enemy and just an all-around bad person. And then they chop his head off, which is crazy, because never before had the people of a nation tried and executed their own leader, their own king, right? And so England is sending out this signal to all the other monarchs in the rest of the world that, hey, they got to obey the rule of law, otherwise they're going to get their head chopped off, just like old King Charles did, right? And so from 1649 onward, until the death of Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell in Parliament, they established a democratic government known as the Commonwealth. And it's kind of a theocracy. It's like a Puritan theocracy in which they impose like laws that outlaw cursing and dancing and Catholicism and illiteracy, and they close down taverns and theaters, and they take away a lot of people's civil liberties. Like you take away someone's ability to cuss and practice religion the way that they want to, or just the fact that you force people to be literate, which is, you should be literate. It's a wonderful thing to be able to read and write. But like, if you take away people's choices, that you're taking away their natural rights. And so when Cromwell dies, England doesn't want necessarily, the people of England don't necessarily want to continue down that road. And so they go back to what they know, what they're familiar with, which is monarchy. And they go and they find Charles II, who is Charles I's son. And he takes over. He's relatively popular. He reopens the bars. He lets people cuss and spit and dance and twirl around and do all those things. And he doesn't really care. He's like really religiously tolerant. So we're pretty cool, right? But unfortunately, he's going to pass away. And then James II is going to take over. And I always think of James II as Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin, because I think there's a strong resemblance between them, right? And he's going to, again, try to retake power from Parliament, because he believes in this idea of divine right. And not only that, but he's also a Catholic, which many people fear that he's going to try to reinstate Catholicism across England, which England doesn't want, because we've already gone through all this weird religious stuff back and forth, not open combat like the rest of Europe, but we've had, religious persecution of Protestants under Mary, and religious persecution of Catholics under Elizabeth, and then under Charles, and then under James II. And so it's problematic, right? And so they call England, some of the nobles in England call up James's daughter, who is Mary, really shortly into his rule. And they ask her and her husband, William, who is a German prince if they would like to come to England and become king and queen. And of course they do, because it's better to be king of England than to be some mid-level prince in Germany somewhere, or the Holy Roman Empire, as it would probably be called during that time frame. And so William and Mary arrive in England, and James II takes off because he doesn't need that noise, right? And so he leaves the country, and it's called the Glorious Revolution because you have a peaceful transition of power between James II to William and Mary. You don't have bloodshed. You don't have a long civil war like we did with the English Civil War, right? But before William and Mary are coronated, they're forced to sign the Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights, which basically guarantees superiority of Parliament over the monarchy. Parliament has to be in session on a yearly basis. The House of Commons is given the power of the purse, or that you can think of it as the power of the spending, the ability to control spending. The king couldn't suspend laws. No Catholic could sit on the throne of England. It guarantees trials by jury to all British subjects. It outlaws cruel and unusual punishments, and it promises habeas corpus, which means that you just can't be thrown in prison without being charged with a crime. And so while the Glorious Revolution doesn't necessarily create a democracy, it does create a limited monarchy. And so it's a step towards giving all the people a voice in the political process, right? The king is very powerful, but there's going to be limits on their power, like Parliament. And so in England, we're not going to see a absolute monarchy, but what we are going to see is a limited monarch, who's a monarch whose power are limited by a legislative body like Parliament. Okay, and that's important because it's a alternative or an alternate form of government, but it's also going to be important because it's going to set the stage for the American Revolution here in 100 years or so. Because by removing one king in favor of another, the American colonists, when they get fed up with King George III and his taxations and abuses of power, they're going to look back to the English Civil War, and then eventually the Glorious Revolution, and be like, hey, you know what? When they were tired of governments, they replaced them, and we have the right to do the same thing as well. So that's going to get us through this little absolutism, constitutionalism kind of idea, and then we're going to pick up with the Enlightenment here in the next video. So hopefully you enjoyed that, and I will see you shortly. Bye-bye.